Good morning and welcome to the Morning Breath live stream where we start our day with coherence. I'm your host, Jeremy Tennell, systems designer and coherence coach. And this is week 11, day 55 of our 14-week journey entitled The Path of Personal Transformation. And today, I want to do something a little different. I've spent the first 10 weeks moving from subject to subject along this journey, but this week I stayed on theme. However, I didn't want to spend 4 days hammering a lesson without sharing how these tools and wisdom have impacted my own life personally. This week, we explored egoic identity, trauma identity, harmful identities, and the deeper self beneath the ego. So instead of another structured wisdom episode, today I want to sit in this conversation with you and hopefully through that process offer something honest for us all to reflect on together. Because one of the things I've learned through systems work, healing, and transformation work is that we cannot guide people towards coherence if we're unwilling to examine it ourselves. So this morning, I'm going to ask myself questions on air. I haven't prepared answers for them. I've only read them after writing them briefly. These questions are around identity, pain, performance, transformation, and the long process of becoming more than the egoic self that I built to survive. This week really asks us to take a look at who we think we are, what identities we defend, and what those identities are producing, not as abstract philosophy, but as lived experience. So I want to move through 4 reflections this morning, each tied to one of this week's themes. As a reminder, coherence is not perfection. Coherence is truth in relationship with itself. So the first section is the ego will gravitate towards any identity that grounds it. This is Monday's theme. One of the biggest realizations for me has been understanding how easily the ego organizes itself around identity. Not because the identity is healthy, but because it feels familiar. And systems operate through familiarity. So I want to sit with that personally. The first question is, what identities have I held onto in my life because they made me feel safe, important, needed, or grounded, even when they may have limited my growth? Well, I think early on, the first identities that I started to realize I was holding on to that were holding me back were being a child, being I'll always be my parents' son, always, but I'm not their child. And at some point, I needed to come to the realization that I couldn't continue to work to adult in my life away from them and then go back home and expect to be treated as that child once again. I remember going home to visit and my mother wanting to buy me clothes when I was in my 30s. And honestly, when I was 29, I let her. But something changed when I was about 30 years old. And I said, I don't think we can do this anymore. Question 2, when I look back honestly, what parts of my personality were actually adaptations or survival patterns? That's a good question. I think that one of the things that I had and have struggled with as a tendency to do is I struggle with My struggle is often being the smartest person in the room. I utilize um, I utilize the personification of intelligence in order to adapt to new situations. We moved a lot when I was a kid, a lot, and I was always having to make new friends. And there were two things that I think I learned really quickly. And both were skills. The first was humor, and I learned how to be funny. And the second was memory and retention. I learned how to retain things, and eventually that retention turned into sounding intelligent. Didn't mean I was intelligent. It just meant I had a lot of information in my head, and I utilized those in order to adapt in new situations, and I carried with me even today. When did I begin mistaking those adaptations for who I am? Oh, I still struggle with that. I'll always probably struggle with that. I mean, I'm getting a, I'm working on a PhD right now. Um, that process is an important process. Ideas are important in our culture, and we can talk about institutions another time, but who pursues that? It's a very specific kind of person that kind of pursues that sort of thing. Question 3, what identities have been hardest for me to release, and what fear existed underneath letting them go? Well, I think that the idea of intelligence is also tied to success for me. And I've been an entrepreneur and a businessman most my life. I've worked for myself, or my wife and I have worked with each other longer than I've worked for someone else. And that journey has been fraught with hard lessons of what it means to be successful and what it means to fail, um, and so I've had to really learn those lessons um, through the years, and that has been a difficult thing to let go. I think that's one of the hardest things about transformation is the ego convinces us, if I let go of this identity, who will I be? But that leads directly into this week's second theme, because the ego is not only attracted to identity, it's incredibly intelligent in how it protects that identity. So the second theme is the ego, and this was Tuesday. The ego is an incredibly deceptive intelligence. The ego rarely introduces itself honestly. It usually arrives disguised as wisdom, protection, responsibility, or certainty. And I've had to confront that in myself many times. So the first question is, what are some ways my ego has disguised fear as wisdom or control as responsibility in my own life? I think that I think that I've often utilized my ability to speak and to hold space in a very outward way, um, as a way of kind of moving through the world, and that was a personification in many respects. That was looking, standing tall, looking controlled, looking like I'm in control, looking like, moving through the world in a manner in which I look like a pillar. That's that's fear, and that might not be like surface anxiety fear, right? Like that might not be this kind of out here sort of fear, but that's very much grounded, rooted, foundational fear, and so that's been a big one. Have there been moments where I believed I was acting from clarity or maturity, but I realized later I was actually protecting an old wound, an insecurity, or an identity? I think that that's a constant. I think that's constantly happening. You know, uh, you, my parents divorced when I was very young, and I was 5 years old when they divorced, and so that's a wound that it doesn't matter when it really kind of happens in a child's life, or a person's life. I mean, um, that's a wound you're going to carry, period. And I carried with me from a very early age. And and one of the things that I think I've realized is that my dynamic with my parents, my dynamic with my wife, my dynamic with before I met my wife, with women I dated, that even though I had gone through counseling and I had worked through things, and I thought I was moving in a healthy way, I would go down the road a spell and realize this pattern that I'm in is not healthy, and it's connected back to all these old patterns that I thought I was working on this whole time. So there are wounds, there are things in your life that are going to come up over and over and over, and you're going to think, man, I really thought I had this licked, but you don't, and that's okay. What does accountability feel like inside my nervous system, and how have I learned the difference between being attacked versus being challenged to grow? That's a great question. That's a great question. For me, accountability in my nervous system feels when I know that I need to be accountable to something that I'm fighting, and I come to that realization, it feels like I can feel it literally sink in, like as if concrete is being poured into my foundation. And I, and I then switch my thinking from defense to, all right, what steps do I need to take in order to be accountable to this? The idea, yeah, and I think that I've thought about responsibility and accountability from a very early age. In my early 20s and my late teens, I started thinking about it and what it meant and how it works, and that's evolved. But in thinking through that, reading an enormous amount on the subject matter, that question about being attacked versus being challenged to grow, I think I have a pretty good sense of when I'm being attacked and when I'm being challenged to grow. And in all honesty, in the past decade, um, with the changing of the world, with the rise of a younger generation, Gen Z coming into their early years, and being so vocal and being so willing to challenge society and others and adults, on the subjects of identity and the subjects of identity, actually. Um, I've seen many, many, many examples of being attacked and being challenged to grow. And I mean, that's kind of the path of youth, right? Is that the our youth fights the system, and they should. That's what they should do. Um, uh, However, one of the things that we always have to keep in mind, and this is wisdom we learn in hindsight, is that what sources are informing them of what the system is and who they are as far as identity, and if those sources are corrupt sources, they provide corrupt challenges, and those challenges have come across quite a bit like attack. But within those lessons, for the rest of us, for all of us, there were massive opportunities to sift through that and find those challenges to grow, because there is a lot of growth when it comes to the concepts race and identity in this culture. And so it's, it wasn't, most certainly was not all bad. And as I think this, especially, I think this is especially important when we begin to talk about trauma and healing, because trauma is real and pain is real, and the body adapts for a reason. But eventually we have to ask ourselves, what happens when the ego builds an identity around a wound and it won't let it heal? So the third section is trauma, identity, healing, transition. And this week we explored this was Wednesday's theme. This week we explored the difference between acknowledging trauma and identifying with trauma. That conversation felt important to me because I think many people are carrying survival identities they no longer realize they are identifying and defending. And I think it's really important to understand that there are many, 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 many things in our culture, especially now in this digital age, that are deeply, deeply wounding, and we've normalized them. And so I think a lot of us are defending wounds. Our identity has covered over them. So the first question is what survival patterns did I once believe were simply my personality, but later realized were adaptations to pain, stress, and instability? Well, I think that when over-sexualization would be the one that I would put into that category. Divorce does a lot of things to the people involved, and children can feel a sense of abandonment from the parent that is no longer around, because or regularly around, because they've been there's a divorce. And I know that I walked away, like I grew up with some huge abandonment issues when it came to my mother. And I know that eventually rolled into an addictive relationship with pornography through my 20s and my 30s, well into my 40s. And it was an inappropriate way of relating to femininity in my life, and I normalized it. I normalized it for a huge portion of my life. I knew that the behavior, that something wasn't quite right with my addiction to pornography, but the personality trait of I'm a man and this is normal, and this is the way I should be. I normalized that, and it created a massive amount of instability in my relationship with my wife, in my relationship with women, and it just in me in general, and had to be worked through, had to be rooted out, and had to be processed. The second question is what did healing begin to look like for me when I stopped asking what happened to me and started asking, who am I becoming now? Yeah, I think that's a huge question, a huge shift of moving from what's wrong with me to what happened to me to who am I becoming. The what happened to me question is a fairly new one in our culture. What's wrong with you? When somebody was doing something that seemed off or culturally unacceptable, or the question that was asked was, what is wrong with you? And that doesn't get to the heart of anything. That just kind of pushes that person off. But when trauma research started to come out about 20 years ago, And, books like The Body Knows the Score, and a number of incredibly wise trauma researchers began to bring data to the table that of how trauma manifests in individuals, but also in culture. The "what happened to me" question became very relevant, and we've spent a good 20 years really digging into that. And um, for better or for worse, but the next question, not the new question, the next question on that journey is, who am I becoming? Because that question transitions you from the trauma to the journey of becoming something greater than that trauma. And you can't remain in the trauma. Once you've identified it, and once you've inventoried it, and once you've understand it, you've got to move forward. So you have to ask yourself, who am I becoming? What can I change now? What would I change now? And who am I becoming? Third question in that subject is, how have practices like breath work, reflection, self-reflection, coherence work helped me reconnect with parts of myself beneath the trauma and the identity? I'll tell a quick story. Probably over a decade ago, I was running a construction business, and I started that business because we were in some financial difficulty, and we came out of the housing crisis and the Great Recession in a difficult place. And when the opportunity for me to get out of retail, which there in my late 30s, I had moved. I had been bumped out of my career because I had to close a business, and had to move into retail, and spent about 5 years working in retail. The opportunity that was presented to me to move forward was was a construction business. So I took it, and I hated it. It was the family business. My father did it. My grandfather did it. I hated it, and I was miserable. I was dealing with payroll issues. I was dealing with employees. I was dealing with, clients, and I was dealing with all of that within an environment in which I didn't enjoy at all. And my wife went and she was certified with the Institute of Heart Math, and I've talked about them briefly. They've done about almost 35 years of research on heart-brain coherence, heart intelligence, breath work, how to engage it. And she brought back a device called an inner balance device, hooked up to my ear. It measured the HRV, which is the rhythm in between heartbeats. There's a ton of information there. And the idea was that you could put yourself in heart-brain intelligence coherence through breath work. And so I practiced, and I kept practicing. And I didn't know what it was doing. I kind of thought it was a little silly, but I didn't, she handed it to me. She was like, try this. I was in a terrible spot. And 2 weeks later, I could feel the shift. I could physically feel the shift in how I was approaching problems, in how I was approaching stress, in how I was approaching issues. I don't even know that I actually realized that in these situations I was breathing shallow all the time, just like, and all of a sudden, this realization allowed me to take a deeper breath and engage my autonomic nervous system and calm myself down. That was the beginning for me. And now I'm researching a PhD that is directly related to the concepts of coherence practices through self-reflection, self-awareness, self-regulation, and ongoing self-inquiry. The only other thing I'll say on that is self-reflection. For whatever reason, I always like to write. And early on, maybe 15 or 16, I started journaling. I think I had a friend that journaled, and she, and she would journal all the time. And so I thought, oh, I'll journal. And I started journaling, and I still have those first journals. And I've read them maybe twice in the past, in my lifetime. They're terrible, right? But that's not the point. The point isn't that you're going to go back and read that stuff. The point is that you're taking the the feedback loop, the reactionary loop that's going in your head that has no feedback whatsoever. It's just reaction. You're taking that loop and you're getting it out of your brain and you're getting it onto paper. And now you've got a feedback loop. You can start asking yourself questions. So reflection, I learned early on. And maybe that's where the deeper invitation begins, because eventually the work stops being, how do I fix myself? And it becomes, what if I am more than the identity my ego built? So the last section is, you are more than the identity your ego built. And that was Thursday's theme. So the final theme this week may be the deepest one for me personally, because transformation is not only about healing pain, it's about reconnecting with something deeper beneath the conditioning. So the first question is when have I experienced moments in my life where I sense something deeper beneath the noise, fear, performance, or identity? I have to thank my grandmother for this. My grandmother was a preacher's wife, and at a very young age, I remember she would talk to me about my soul, about spirituality, about this nature of myself that I can't touch, right? It's not physical. I can't think through. It's not mental. But once it was pointed out to me, I knew it was there. I always knew it was there. I think this is what invisible friends are when you're a child. I think that this is that magical time in our childhood, in which reality and fantasy are a blend. That spirit is still new. It's still fresh. Some of us experience trauma very early on, and it can be very difficult for us to understand and relate to that. But if you're quiet in breath, use your breath, you know it's there. And when we do our breath work today, I'll take us through a breath work in which we'll just try and let it rise to the surface a little bit. Let it come out of the deep, because it's there. And so and that self is the eternal self. My body is going to die. My mind is going to die. But whatever this is, it's going to pass on, like this, what is it? The first law of thermodynamics, energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only transition from one state to another. Second question is, what practices most consistently help me reconnect with coherence, presence, and the deeper sense, deeper self beneath the ego? Breath work's a big one, because it's so easy to access. It's not meditation. It's not, I can actually occupy my mind and engage my mind to actually help myself find coherence. So I'm not trying to silence the ego in that process. However, meditation has been a powerful experience. This past year, I've had the opportunity to meditate twice a week with a Buddhist nun and a group, and that practice has been incredibly helpful to understand this process. So, self-reflection practices, journaling, but I would go a little further, like not just journaling, but drawing, sketching, making mandalas, painting, music. These creative practices, I think, engage a sense of self that is below the ego. The next question is if I stripped away performance, achievement, fear, identity, and conditioning, What qualities or truth do I believe remain at the center of who I am? Whew. Well, when it comes right down to it, and I think I've always known this, and I think that my journey and my spiritual journey has often been tied to my religious journey, which has been tumultuous. I grew up in a Christian home. I was heavily involved in the church until I turned 30, when I walked away from it completely. That didn't mean I walked away from my faith or faith in general or, understanding who I am spiritually. It meant that I wasn't going to stay confined in that box. And being who I am, I read everything I could get my hands on. I started with the Book of Buddha. I read Sanskrit documents, the Bhagavad Gita, the Apocalypse. I'm looking over at my bookshelf. The Apocryph text from the Bible that came out of the Dead Sea Scrolls, ancient Jewish Hermeticism. I've read as anything I could. And I think what I've come to the conclusion is that we live in a world in which materialism is valued, which means that the physical self is what is valued overall, and the intellectual self is the driver within the vehicle to get you there, wherever there is. And we completely ignore that self, that eternal self that is inside all of us, that is the spark of life. I can take what the human body is made of, all the minerals, all the water, and I can pour it out on a table, and in the exact proportion of a human body, and I can take all those minerals and all those, all that, and pour it out on a table, and then I can say, dance, and it won't do anything. What illuminates humanity, life, everything around us? For us to think that this physical self is the only thing there is like growing up in a closet because we were told that's the only world there is, and never grabbing the door handle that was unlocked and just turning it and cracking the light into the darkness. We have got to connect to something deeper, because our human little system is not sustainable, because we built it off of the intellectual and the physical. So what remains who I am is what remains I am always. And it's not named Jeremy, and it's not a funny guy, and it's not a smart guy. It is always. So I think that that's the real invitation this week. It's not about self-hatred, or it's not about the destruction of the ego, or pretending we don't have wounds or conditioning, but learning how to relate to those things differently, learning how to observe them without becoming possessed by them, learning how to practice coherence instead of rehearsing suffering, learning how to breathe deeply instead of fearing the quieter self beneath the noise. So before we close this week, let's go into some breath work. We're going to do about 5 minutes. And as promised, we're not going to do a gratitude list today. What I want you to do is I want you to start with a breath in through your nose, out with a sigh. Exhale all that breath out. Inhale through your nose, out with a big sigh. Inhale once again for about 6 seconds. Exhale through your mouth. Inhale for 6. Exhale through your mouth. Keep that pattern going. Close your eyes or lighten your gaze. Again. Relax your face and your shoulders, your jaw. Find a rhythmic pattern to your breath. Once your autonomic nervous system is calmed, pay attention to the breath. Pay attention to as it enters your nose. Feel it move across your upper lip. Pay attention to it as it exits across your lips. Now follow the breath into your lungs. Imagine spinning around your heart. Follow it back out. Do it again. Again. I want you to keep that pattern up. I want you to concentrate on the breath. Listen to my voice. Follow the breath into your lungs, around your heart, back out again. As you concentrate on the breath, you're not identifying with your thoughts. And if you go back to your thoughts for a moment, let them pass and sink back down below the surface to just where you're paying attention to your breath. Do this for a moment. The breath is the way station to the deep. As you breathe, observe all your thoughts just moving above you. Just let them pass like a freeway, and you're lying underneath it. Like boats on the surface of the water, and you're below them. Feel the space around you. Use your breath. You are in the space where you could meet this other self, this deeper self. Let it rise up from the deep. Descend down to meet it. Don't be afraid of yourself. Let's come back into this space. Take a deep breath. Exhale with a sigh. Again. Exhale with a sigh. If this week resonated with you, stay with this work, because coherence is not built through one breakthrough. It's built through breath by breath, practice by practice, reflection by reflection, truth by truth. And the deeper self beneath the ego does not appear all at once. It emerges slowly. Every time we choose awareness over reaction, every time we choose responsibility over blame, every time we choose truth over performance. You are not only the identity you built to survive. There is a deeper self beneath the noise, waiting for you to become coherent enough to finally meet it. Take a breath. I'll see you next week.